I will indeed compliment Terry's presentation. That was a really good presentation, Terry. Very bad joke. It's always a slightly nervy experience speaking in front of a crowd who are drinking pints. You don't know whether they're going to end up toasting you or throwing them at you. So hopefully the former. Thanks to Galway One World Centre and Claiming Our Future for organising this event, and thanks to Nessa for chairing it. The organisation of which I'm chairperson, AFrI, did some work on the IMF and the EU so-called bailout package, the Irish debt crisis, and what we can learn from the global south before Christmas, and we've been trying to build on that work since. But I've been surprised to see in recent times some people seeming to think that actually we generally, not just AFrI, are paying too much attention to these issues. And this is from the Irish Times on the 9th of February, where I quote, "The total preoccupation of election candidates with bank bailouts and the IMF to the exclusion of debating serious social concerns was deeply worrying," the chief executive of the children's charity Barnardo's has said. This is Fergus Finlay. He was speaking at the publication of their manifesto, kind of children's manifesto, a contribution to the election debate. And he said the political parties had to start opening up this debate about the social crisis. And he was echoing a call by the chief executive of the Carers Association the previous week, who'd said he was worried that pressing social issues were getting lost in the election. And I suppose I was quite surprised at this disjunction between the social crisis and the EU-IMF related debt crisis. Because just 10 days prior to Fergus Finlay issuing that call, on January 31st, Anglo-Irish Bank, which we own, paid out on a maturing bond. That is, it repaid a debt worth $750 million. We don't know who that lender was. We know that they lent that money to Anglo-Irish Bank in January of 2006. We know that it was unsecured debt, which means that it was not covered by the state guarantee, and yet it was paid out. 750 million. Can you imagine what that could have done for homelessness or for carers' allowances? And by the way, the issue of not knowing who these creditors are is one of the most urgent issues that needs to be addressed. Greek colleagues are calling for a debt audit, and that's an initiative that we might also usefully explore in Ireland. But I suppose my point I'm trying to make here is that unless we stop that hemorrhage of resources, then children's rights campaigners and carers campaigners will be battling for scraps. They'll be fighting over the bones of the economy after the carcass has been picked clean by international creditors. And will be picked clean, as Terry has mentioned, more by the EU than the IMF. And I think for Irish political discourse, this is one of the things we need to get our head around here. The EU is, in many ways, a much more hardline neoliberal organisation these days than even the IMF. We adverted to that in our AFrI paper that we published towards the end of last year on the issue of senior bondholders being singed or taking a mild haircut. The EU ruled that out. The IMF might have been slightly open to it. The cutting of the minimum wage appears to have been an EU initiative, not an IMF initiative. And that same pattern is true if you look at EU-IMF packages in places like Latvia and Romania, where the EU has been very determined to protect the interest of Swedish and Austrian banks and has forced extreme austerity programs on those countries. And a paper from the London School of Economics last year talked about the European rescue of the Washington Consensus, which essentially is the neoliberalism that Shane was talking about. And that has been maintained to a greater extent in its pure form by the EU, even as the IMF has shown some very, very limited signs of willingness to compromise on some of those tenets. And I think that has very important implications for us in terms of how we approach the EU politically. Jean Kerrigan, writing in the Sunday Independent last month, I think put his finger on this when he said, "Any politician claiming to represent the interests of the citizens needs to throw a political hand grenade into the cosy club at the heart of the EU." And I think we have to move on this. And I know last year Claiming Our Future wrote a letter to EU Commissioner Olli Rehn pointing out that the bailout deal violated stated EU commitments to equality. But I think the time for letter writing is over. That's not going to get us anywhere. I think there's a quote I'm often reminded of that's attributed to Bismarck, where he allegedly said, the German statesman, where he allegedly said, if somebody kicks you and you lick their boot, they'll kick you again. and it's time, I think, to get out of that pattern. Damien Kyberd, writing in the Sunday Times last Sunday, outlined what a more bolshy approach to this issue might look like. He talked about burning all subordinated bonds and all senior unsecured bonds, giving them a haircut of 80%. This is basically creditors who took out a riskier debt, who wouldn't expect in the normal course of events to get repaid in full. He recommends an 80% haircut. In that case, to use the terminology, that would save you 17 billion euros. And he recommends that the senior secured bonds, the sort of AAA rated creditors, should have a 50-50 cut imposed upon them. That would save 19 billion. Now, from a practical point of view, that might be where we'd end up, and Terry adverted to that at the end of his presentation, but I think as a negotiating position, repudiation and complete default is a much more sensible starting position as to where we should be. And Kyberd makes the point that the markets already expect us to do that. Creditors who are trying to sell on Irish debt at the moment are taking about 50-60 cents in the euro. They're already factoring in what they anticipate will be a write-down. The fact that the Irish government is guaranteeing to pay 100 cents is regarded as a laughing stock in places like Wall Street. I don't know if people read the media reports around a Vanity Fair piece on Ireland that Michael Lewis, a former trader, wrote. It's a very, very funny piece, but he recounts the story of a Merrill Lynch trader who in September 2008 was desperately trying to sell Irish government debt at a discount of 50% or more, and he couldn't do so. And he woke up the next morning, the day after the bank guarantee, to realise that the Irish government was actually going to give him 100% on it, much to his shock. As has been mentioned, even financial sector economists are now accepting the reality of the need for default. Goodbody Stockbrokers is talking about a 50% write-down on at least the subordinated or unguaranteed bank bonds. And it has started happening elsewhere. The Danish Amerge Bank was nationalised earlier this month by the Danish government. Senior bondholders were given a 41% discount, 41% debt write-down, as were depositors who held more than 100,000 euros. And that's an interesting facet of the Irish experience. Also, we gave a blanket guarantee to deposits. The norm in most other European countries, if you're giving a deposit guarantee, is to only give it up to 100,000 euros. Anybody with more than that can take care of themselves. Again, we're out of line on that. There are risks to that kind of threat of default and the reality of default. There may be issues around liquidity, but I think the alternative is worse. The alternative is the Greek example, which is a little bit ahead of us, where the economy is being ground down into the dirt. And last weekend, the EU and IMF mission to Greece demanded that the Greek government sell off 50 billion euros worth of state assets in order to repay their debt. An EU official is reported as having told the Greek delegation that they should think about selling some beaches to repay this debt. And if you think that's outlandish, some Irish land may get sold as well. Quilcha, the state-owned forestry company, is set for privatisation. One of the companies that has expressed an interest in buying that land is a Swiss hedge fund on whose board sits former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. So this can happen here. At least, however, the Greek response has been somewhat more vigorous than the Irish response in terms of resistance. There's been a wave of strikes in Greece. Transport workers struck in December at the time of the passage of the budget. Doctors and health workers struck earlier this month. There's going to be a full-scale public sector strike towards the end of this month, in a couple of days' time, in fact, in Greece. And I think it's one of the saddest things for many of us, I think, in the last couple of years in Ireland has been the absence of serious strike action here in Ireland. And it has been, quite frankly, a disgrace on the part of the trade union leadership. And I think part of the passivity may come from the fact that people have been thinking, well, we're going to have an election soon and we can throw them out anyway, and that'll be the way in which we'll express our opposition. But of course, as Fintan O'Toole said in an article in today's Irish Times, is there any other democracy where 55% of the electorate would freely vote for a $15 billion austerity programme combined with a $100 billion transfer of wealth from citizens to banks? And that he gets his 55% figure from adding together the opinion poll support for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, whom, as Terry has pointed out, have identical policies for dealing with this issue. But obviously, if there's an expectation that the deal will be substantively renegotiated, as Terry has made clear, that's not going to happen in the wake of the election. And I think instead of just changing the government, we need to seriously think about changing the orientation and indeed the leadership of the trade unions and the social movements in Ireland, and inculcating a much more contestatory and mobilising attitude on the part of those groups. And I think there's a perception that there's enough anger out there to make that possible. An IMF report on how Ireland is doing, kind of a report card, contained the following wonderful sentence. It's come out a few weeks ago. It said, "There is a lingering domestic perception of inequitable burden sharing among the Irish population," though God knows where they could have got that from. They didn't actually say that. But I think that the IMF fears that lingering domestic perception will persist, and I think it will persist. And our challenge is going to be to mobilise it and feed those flames of anger, because it's not going to go away anytime soon. And I think once this election is over, I think we need to forget about voting and letter writing, and we need to start seriously thinking about how we begin striking and occupying and fighting, and, as in Argentina, generating a social movement that can make the government genuinely fearful of the people. Thank you.